Welcome to John Lecture 11. By now, you know that we're about one chapter behind for each episode. So we're in chapter 10. This image behind me is an interior view of the Jerusalem temple, confiscated from someplace on the internet. But in John chapter 10, Jesus is still inside the Temple Mount, or in the language I like to use, he is still at the temple because the enclosed portion is the Holy of Holies and the holy place. And then we have the various courts, and he would have taught in these outer courts, not inside the inner courts where the more ritual activities were taking place. So when we come to John 10, of course, we want to start with an outline. The outline begins with a parable. There's discussion about whether there are parables in the fourth gospel, but I think this one pretty much is because of the language that's used. It's also an I am saying, but it's more parabolic. Or parable-like, because parabolic doesn't mean parable-like, but we have that. And then in verses 7 through 10, he talks about being the door. 11 through 18, he is talking about being the good shepherd. And in 19 through 21, in tremendous Johannine form, we have a division between those who are listening. That shifts now in verse 22 through 30 to a different festival, the Feast of Dedication. After that, in verses 31 through 39, we have a second attempt to stone him, following on chapter 8. And then in verses 40 through 42, he departs across the Jordan River. And so I find John 10 to be perhaps the least accessible chapter because it is a tad bit unclear. Let me demonstrate. If we go to John chapter 10 and we go down to the end of the section where he is talking about the dedication, right? John 10:22, at that time, the feast of the dedication took place in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Jesus walking in the temple in the portico of Solomon. Is what comes beforehand, verses 1 through 21, at the festival of dedication, and John 9 stops, or is John 10 a continuation of the dialogue that Jesus is having with those who responded to the blind man? It is simply unclear. And so I'm going to take it as a follow-up to John chapter 9. So let's begin. When we look at the parable, it gets a little bit complex. So we're going to read the first 6 verses. This is the New American Standard Bible. Truly, truly, I say to you, he who does not enter by the door into the fold of the sheep, but climbs up some other way, he is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is a shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. When he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him because they do not know the voice of strangers. And then verse 6, this figure of speech, perhaps parable, it's a poema, a allegory, perhaps metaphor. This figure of speech, Jesus spoke to them, but they did not understand what those things were which he had been saying to them. Like many parables, not quite certain. And so then he clarifies it in verses 7 through 10. I am the door of the sheep. Now he's a door. All who came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters through me, he will be saved and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I came that they may have life, and have it abundantly. Evidently, at some point I memorized might have life, may have life. So when we look at this, we have in verse 1, he who does not enter by the door. We have the comparison with thief and robber. And in verse 7, we have that he is the door. Verse 8, the others are thieves and robbers. In verse 2, he who enters by the door is a shepherd. In verse 9, I am the door. If anyone enters through me, right? To him the doorkeeper opens, the sheep hear his voice. A stranger they will not follow, but will flee because they do not know the voice. Right? The sheep did not hear him in verse 8 because they don't know the voice. And so we have an explanation in verses 7 through 10 of what he is talking about in verse 1, at least to a degree. That makes it a little kind of interesting. And then we have another parable, another I am saying in verse 11. I am the good shepherd. Okay? The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep. He who is a hired hand and not a shepherd, who is not the owner of the sheep, sees the wolf coming, leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf snatches them and scatters them. He flees because he is a hired hand and is not concerned about the sheep. And then he says again, I am the good shepherd. I know my own and my own know me, even as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep which are not of this fold. I must bring them also, and they will hear my voice, and they'll become one flock with one shepherd. And so when we have a comparison, as you can see on the notes for the video for the class, we have the parable talking about entering, we have a door, we have sheep. In the first 6 verses, we have those same things in 7 through 10 clarified. But in verses 11 through 18, there is a comparison of the voice, okay? The language of I know, and then the authority. But what we have in these 3 tad bit confusing statements by Jesus are references to some things that have happened before. You might have, or you may not have, caught the reference in verse 1 through 6, right? About entering. Whoa. We haven't heard that word for quite some time, but it is available in John 3, verse 4. Jesus talking with Nicodemus. One cannot enter into the kingdom of God unless one is born from above. We also have in John 4 a discussion of that in verse 38. Right? Not having all of verse 4 memorized, let's go to that text. And he says to them, to his disciples, I sent you to reap that for which you have not labored. Others have labored, and you have entered into their labor. Is there significance in the use of this word? Well, there might be. But only if we think that John likes to layer information upon itself. If we view these as separate, unconnected episodes, then of course there's no significance to them. But what do we have? We have the talking about Jesus coming. We have the shepherd. We have the sheep. We have entering to a place where the sheep are. We have going to call other voices. Those sorts of things are sometimes related. But when it comes to a voice, it becomes even more interesting, because in chapter 3, voice is sound. They don't have a different word. And in verse 8 of chapter 3, the wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, the voice of it. And then in verse 29 of chapter 3, we have the bridegroom who hears, or the bridegroom's friend who hears the voice of the bridegroom. And John the Baptizer is referring to that. We can jump down into chapter 5, where we have in verse 25 and following, in a couple different places, some references. Truly, truly, I say to you, an hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who will hear will live. And verse 28, do not marvel at this, for an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice. But to hear the Spirit, or the sound of the Spirit, one must be born from above. And in verse 37, one final time in chapter 5, the Father who has sent me, he has testified of me. You have neither heard his voice or seen his form. So it's about hearing a voice and belonging to them. And now in chapter 10, he's wrapping these things up as the story moves quickly towards the ultimate Passover celebration. So there's conflict and statements, and then we have some language of shepherds, which we'll look at here shortly. But there's also the issue of not understanding, right? That they don't fully understand his voice. So if we look then at chapter 10, once again to link ourselves, in verses 1 through 6, they do not know the voice of strangers. And in verse 6, they did not understand what those things were, which he had been saying to them. Which raises the question in the Gospel of John, do people understand what Jesus is saying, or do they not quite get it? Well, I think you would say they don't quite get it, but where do they not quite get it? Well, they don't quite get it in the prologue, right? As we look at John 1, verse 10. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him, did not understand him. In chapter 3, in the discussion with Nicodemus, Jesus said to him in verse 10, are you the teacher of Israel and do not understand these things? Truly, truly, we speak of what we know and testify of what we have seen, but you do not accept our testimony. So you don't hear the voice, you do not accept the testimony, you do not recognize those things. We have a series of symbolic language which leads us to see some connections. And then we have that in chapter 10, verse 6, but again in chapter 12. Don't always like to forecast what is happening, but this is a good time to do so. I'm sorry, verse 16 of chapter 12. The narrator speaking. These things his disciples did not understand at the first. But when Jesus was glorified, then they remembered that these things were written of him and that they had done these things to him. So at least we're aware that it's not unusual to not understand the words of Jesus, because even the disciples did not understand at the time that he was speaking to them. Rather, they only understood them when they had been, chapter 3, born from above, born of the Spirit. Jesus had been glorified. He had been crucified and exalted to heaven. So some of the connections that we have with those ideas. When we look at the third of those parables, John 10, verses 11 through 18, we have the statement, which will come in frequently and somewhat sometimes ironic, sometimes not ironic. The language, I know. Right? Verse 14, I am the good shepherd, and I know my own, and my own know me. Now, there are two words in Greek to refer to knowing. One is factual. I have information that I possess. And one is more experiential. I know this because it happened to me. I know streets in a certain town. I can look at it on the map and know their names, but I don't know them. I don't know the sound. I don't know the smell. I don't know the feel. I don't know the breeze that blows and where to stand to catch the breeze on a hot day. It's a difference in the knowing. And he says here that he knows them experientially and they know him experientially. That this following of Jesus is not simply a mental activity. And then once again, we have the voice, but then we have authority, right? At the end, which I didn't read earlier, verse 17, for this reason the Father loves me, because I lay down my life so that I may take it again, or take it up again. No one has taken it away from me, but I lay it down on my own initiative. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. This commandment I received from my Father. So Jesus is indicating here at this point what is going to happen. Now, the disciples are still a little bit not understanding, which would be a good way to say that. But he is indicating what is happening. He has authority. Now, when we talk about authority, we have a couple of opportunities in chapter 1, verse 12, right? But as many believed in him, he gave to them the authority to become children of God. In chapter 5, verse 27, we did not read that one earlier, but it's right there in the middle of the language with verse 28. Just as the Father has life in himself, even so he gave it to the Son also to have life in himself. So the life language. And he gave him authority to execute judgment, because he is the Son of Man. So do not marvel that an hour is coming in which all who are in the tombs will hear his voice. And then we have a forward look. John chapter 17, verse 2. Verse 1 and 2, Jesus spoke these things. Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you, even as you gave him authority over all flesh, that to all whom you have given him, he may give eternal life. So what does John 10 then tell us about his authority? Well, he has the authority to lay down his life and to take it up again. And that's about to happen. And so here in this section of John chapter 10, as he's concluding what I think is this lengthy time at the Festival of Booths in the fall between John 7 and John 10, verse 20, we have these parables. So we're going to pause or actually stop the recording at this point in time and come back and pick up on what happens after the parables. See you shortly. Or you'll see me shortly, most likely.